I was driving down the interstate the other day when I came up behind a truck, and I saw a large sign on the truck that said, "If you cannot see my mirrors, I cannot see you." And we all know that when we have a car in our blind spot, that that's not a very good thing. In fact, it could be dangerous. But it made me think about our blind spots. It made me think about what our blind spots can do to us as well-intentioned people, and that sometimes, perhaps, we're not as inclusive as others as we think we are. So I want to talk a little bit about inclusion today and about the inclusion paradox, that it is true that we are all human beings and that we are all alike. We share a human experience. Paradoxically, however, we are all uniquely different. We all have different DNA, different fingerprints, different patterns in our eyes, and we all have different stories and different experiences and different frames of reference on the world. But I think the issue of inclusion is actually, in this bullet point, is we are like some people more than others, that we have a propensity for affinity bias. We have a preference to surround ourselves with people who are like us. However, it is nevertheless a part of the human experience that we all have a deep need to feel included. So you would think that if we all have a deep need to feel included, that the path to inclusion would be smooth, flat, and completely without obstacles. And yet I'd like to suggest to you today that not only is it not flat and smooth, it's actually filled with visible and invisible obstacles that stop us, even when we think we're being inclusive, from being fully inclusive. It will not surprise you to know that our in-group is smaller than our out-group. But it may surprise you that in recent years, in the field of neuropsychology, has been able to demonstrate that the neural pathways that we use when we think about ourselves and the neural pathways we use when we think about members of our in-group are the same neural pathways, causing us to be much more empathetic and much more sympathetic to people in our in-group. We use different neural pathways for people in our out-group, causing us to be somewhat indifferent to their success or failure. I was in Dallas-Fort Worth Airport a few years ago, and it was pre-9/11, and I had an unconscious habit that I didn't realize I had until that particular evening. When I boarded the plane, I would always look to the left and look into the cockpit, and on this particular evening, there was a woman sitting behind the pilot's seat. Now, she smiled at me, and I smiled at her. And then I sat down, and my stomach began to churn. And then my inner voice started to run like a ticker tape that said, "Oh my goodness, perhaps I need to change my flight. Really, a woman flying this plane to Fort Lauderdale tonight? A 757, a woman pilot? Now, I'm a diversity consultant, and I am not meant to think like that." So I then began to examine, what is happening? Why am I thinking like that? And I realized that I had a blind spot, that for me, the image of a competent airline pilot looks like this. He's tall, he's male, he's white, he preferably has silver gray hair, and he looks like he's ex-military. Now, he could fly the plane. I wasn't sure that she could. I'd like to share with you some of the data from Cognizant, my unconscious bias assessment tool. This is aggregate data from quite a large number of people from different client systems. And what you're looking at is 70% of this group were men and 30% were women. And what you can see in these results is that the men said that men exhibit leadership qualities greater than women do, that men are more assertive than women, and that men are more serious about their careers than women. However, they also said that men and women were valued equally for their revenue generation skills and were equally likely to be allocated major projects. But let's look at what the women said, the 30% of the group that were women. It may surprise you to see that the women also said that men exhibit greater leadership skills. The women also said that men are slightly more serious about their careers than men, and the women also said that men are more assertive than women. They did, however, disagree with the men on the issue of being valued for their revenue-generating skills and being valued or likely to be allocated major projects and clients. Now, how can this be? Because consciously we believe that we are actually striving for equity, that we have a meritocracy in our organizations, and that we're being fair, and that we're conscious of the gender differences. And yet, not just the men, but the women were colluding in this process. So, implicit biases are very pervasive. In fact, of the 15 million people who have taken Harvard University's IAT test, 80% of that group cannot, of both men and women, cannot resist the tendency to associate men with careers and women with home. Now, I had a professor once who said there's no such thing as the innocent eye, and that we really are not always seeing as clearly as we think we are. The brain distorts the message. In fact, we actually do physically have a blind spot in the retina of each eye. And it wouldn't stretch the imagination to think that perhaps this giraffe is looking at himself and saying, "Oh my, I look a little bit small and fat today." Because the brain distorts the reflection. And if it's distorting the reflection of ourselves, what is it doing in terms of your reflection or patterns for other people? Deepak Chopra said that our ideal body weight is hiding inside of us, waiting to be discovered. Just like Michelangelo discovered the David in that piece of rock. But what I'd like to suggest to us today is that there's a better self hiding inside each of us. There's a better self who's capable of being more inclusive than we really are. Because despite the fact that we're well-intentioned, we're not always as inclusive of other human beings, particularly if they're not like us. Now, David's face is carved in marble in perpetuity. However, as part of our human experience, we have many faces. I'd like to talk about a couple of them today. First of all, we have what I call our professional face. That's the face that we take out of the car in the morning as we go to work. That's the face that we use when we're doing business with other people. But we also have our politically correct face. That's the face you use when you're saying one thing and thinking another. But then I believe we have what I call your curious tourist face. Your curious tourist face is when you go overseas and you visit another country and you meet the people and you love the locals and you love their food and their music and their tradition, and maybe you even buy some touristy things to take home to remind you of the trip. But just so long as they don't all move into your neighborhood. We also have what I call an irritated customer face. And I'm sure you can relate to the idea of being in a taxi somewhere and the taxi driver doesn't speak your language and perhaps he gets you lost and you get a little irritated. One of the blind spots that I've noticed is that we are willing to express more irritation towards people from a different culture than we are towards people from our own culture. And so that's something that I like to pay attention to, is when I'm dealing with people who are different from me. So in terms of language, language is one of the areas that I do think language, accent, pace of speech, tone of voice are all areas that we can actually imperceptibly cause us to have blind spots and to treat people differently. I was in Publix once and I asked the woman for 6 bagels and she said, "Oh my, you sound so intelligent." And I said, well, the fact that she's right isn't really the issue. The issue is, what was she projecting onto me? And what she was projecting was intelligence, whereas it made me question, what does she project onto other people? I'd like to share with you also some data from my unconscious bias tool, and this time comparing Anglo to non-English speaking background, where you can see that in every instance, people from non-English speaking backgrounds were rated lower than people of Anglo descent. And what this is suggesting that there is a real issue around the talent pipeline and around how people's careers can progress when we have these blind spots and these unconscious biases that are impacting our decisions about people's competence. So I'd like to ask you to choose 2 colors that you really like the most. Just shout out a couple of colors. I heard blue and yellow, okay? So now I'd like you to choose 2 colors that you like the least. So what happened, because what I noticed there is you were very quick when I asked you the first time, but the second time there was a silence that fell over the room. Let me tell you what happened. It's called the Stroop Effect. It was developed by a man called John Ridley Stroop in 1935, an Englishman, and what he discovered was that the brain seeks congruency. The brain is lazy, the brain is habitual, it seeks congruency. The first slides were easy because they were congruent. The color matched the swatch. The second slides, the color and the words do not match. So it causes us to have an imperceptible hesitation. It is in that hesitation that we can exclude people. So this time I'd like to ask you to pick 2 people that you would least like to have on your team. 1 and 4? I hear 1 and 4. Okay. Interestingly, 1 and 4, on every single time I do this exercise, either 1 and 4 or 3 and 4 are picked as the people that would be least welcome on someone's team. The ensuing discussion is always about the issue of appearance and height and weight. And so these are also issues in which we can exclude others. I was on a flight from Canberra to Sydney just last year, and it was a 30-seater commuter flight when a female voice, the female flight attendant was in the aisle serving the orange juice when I heard a female voice come over the intercom. And she said, "Ladies and gentlemen, we're at 27,000 feet. We'll be landing in Sydney shortly. I hope you've enjoyed your flight." I looked at the flight attendant and I thought, her mouth isn't moving. How can this be? And then I realized, oh my goodness, there's a female pilot and I forgot to check. And at 27,000 feet, I was not exercising the option to get off the plane. Socrates said that the unexamined life is not worth living. But I would like to suggest to you today that the unchallenged brain is not worth trusting. And I would like to invite you to think about what it is you do to exclude others. What is it you do that might be a blind spot for you that may cause you, if you paid attention to it, to widen the size of your in-group? Thank you.